Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. I want to welcome you. My name is Dr. Cecilia Tamori. I'm an associate professor and director of global public health and community health at the Johns Hopkins School of Nursing and also at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. I head up the engagement group for the Opioid Industry Documents Archive team. And it's our great pleasure to welcome you to our first research workshop, exploring the opioid industry documents, research communities, educational opportunities, and community data. Let me just walk you through a little bit of housekeeping. We are going to get started with our plenary talk in just a moment. When you are thinking of questions that you may want to pose, please feel free to put them into the Q&A area. When we are ready, we will then facilitate a Q&A session at the end of the talk, and then we will move on to our other speakers. So first of all, also quick acknowledgements. I want to acknowledge the Johns Hopkins Center for Medical Humanities and Social Medicine, who is our wonderful host today, and also our collaboration between Johns Hopkins University and UCSF, who collaborate to host this wonderful archive. Okay, so with the housekeeping in mind and we're all set, I would love to move on to introducing our wonderful plenary speaker, Professor Keith Wailoo, who is Henry Putnam University Professor of History and Public Affairs at Princeton University, as well as the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. Now, Professor Wailoo has many, many accomplishments, and I'm not going to get into all the details, but I want you all to know that he has written numerous award-winning books, and he's going to be talking a little bit about Pushing Cool, and particularly his most recent book, which extensively uses archival work. And obviously he has received numerous awards, such as the Dan David Prize, and was also elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. So this is a very, very abbreviated introduction, but I'll turn it over. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Cecilia, for the introduction and also for the invitation to talk about my previous work in the Truth Tobacco Industry Documents as they pertain to the opportunities provided by the Opioid Industry Documents Archive. So I've been asked to talk a little bit based on the fact that I wrote this book, Pushing Cool, about the benefits and challenges of navigating a born digital archival collection, to reflect a bit on the process of doing research and writing the book Pushing Cool, which is about the history of the tobacco industry's marketing and development of the menthol cigarette. And to talk about how research in the tobacco collection helped to generate unanticipated questions and findings, and then finally to reflect on implications for the OIDA Research Archive. For those of you who don't know, most of you probably do, the Truth Tobacco Archive is a fairly extensive one, an archive of over 14 million documents that are created by tobacco companies about their advertising, manufacturing, marketing, and the scientific research and political activities that was hosted by the UCSF library. And this archive, among many other archives, well, this archive in particular was produced as a result of the master settlement agreement between states attorneys generals, the Department of Justice, and numerous sectors of the industry in 1998, which provides an unparalleled look behind the curtain at the history of industry practices. This archive, alongside archival holdings at Penn State University, Hagley Museum and Library, Columbia, Duke University, as well as digitized medical science and public media, as well as looking at digitized newspapers and a lot of other records, went into writing this book on the history, the tangled and complicated history of the mentholated cigarette. What I want to do today is to give you just a very quick overview of some things that I learned as I delved into the tobacco documents by focusing on how a single term, a single search term like menthol, could evolve into an entire book that looks behind the curtain to understand a web of relationships and strategies and practices that evolved over the course of more than a century. And the goal here is to sort of begin the conversation about how the work in the tobacco archives could be useful in thinking about how to navigate the OIDA archives. Now, one second, I'm just going to try to move my screen around a little bit here. One of the Of course, the truth tobacco industry documents cover some basic elements of internal communications within different firms in the tobacco industry so that you're able to have this unparalleled insight into sort of administrative, executive decision-making and research, as well as the work of consultants for the industry, communications with those consultants, and the kinds of smoker surveys and a wide range of documents that are produced in service of the industry. And for me, it was documents like this, Searching Menthol in the 1960s, where my curiosity about the history of menthol smoking started. It was documents like this, which were a study of smokers' attitudes, especially Black smokers' attitudes towards the Salem brand and the Kool brand in April of 1969, which made a fairly bold claim. And that is that Kool was in the Negro market, and it is the cigarette to smoke. And the name itself not only describes a desirable product property, it is also a perfect match with what may be the most highly valued personality trait among Negroes, i.e. savoir-faire or coolness. And you could see why this claim sits at the center of tobacco advertising in the 1960s, this notion that there's a special affinity between Black people and Kool cigarettes would draw my attention and prompt me to ask this broader question, which is, not only is this true, but what is the basis of this claim? And is there a backstory to the claim? So whether or not you're writing a book about an archive like this or an article, it starts with a question. What could the archives reveal about, in this case, menthols that are not already evident in looking at advertisements, public sources, like an advertisement like this from the 1940s, in which Kool claims that it's a treatment for what is called smoker's throat, or an advertisement like this from the 1950s in which their mascot, Willie the Penguin, says, when April showers make you cough like crazy, refreshing Kools taste fresh as a daisy. If you got a cough, switch from Hots to Kools. So the documents give you a sense of how you go from that kind of claim, which is at the centerpiece of how Kools emerged on the smoker market in the 1930s into the 1940s and 50s, to this kind of marketing pitch in the 1960s, 70s, into the 80s and beyond. The notion that Kool was not just a health cigarette as it was understood in the early days, but a Black themed cigarette as it became reconceptualized. How did that transformation happen? How, when, and did menthol cigarettes become a Black campaign theme? So my study, as I looked more closely, gathering documents, just continuing to search what menthols meant across time, became a study of how markets are made and remade, health markets into racially inflected markets. Early in the century, menthol cigarettes had nothing to do with race. And if you ask any industry executive or look for any documents that made it such a claim, you wouldn't find them because they were pitched as health products. And it became a study of how you understand and track a changing business rationale, how menthol smoking began, surprisingly, as a defensive concern to reassure smokers about this thing called smoker's cough. The book became, in time, the study of the people behind these campaigns, the backstory to the advertising behind the image. Who were the researchers? Who were the physiologists, the psychologists, the urban sociologists, the people informing the industry? People like Howard Haggard at Yale University, who was approached by marketers for a cool cigarette in the 1930s, who wanted to study a competing company's claim that menthols were damaging. And so Howard Haggard, as a physiologist, began to study this and made some observations about menthol as a perversion of sensation, but also explained to the marketers that while he was happy to provide this contract service, that they should not use his material for marketing. And then a few years later, they came up to him and they said, we'd like to use your material for marketing. And this document from 1935 is one in which he objects, and he says, it's exactly this exploitation that you're now suggesting, even though I told you that I didn't want my research exploited in this way. So the tensions, you might say, over brand competition, the tensions between scientists, consultants, marketers, and the industry became much more central to the history of the of menthol cigarettes in general. Beyond company correspondences, the Tobacco Truth Documents also offers an unparalleled amount of data. You could actually reconstruct a great deal about the sales, about brand preferences, because the industry spent enormous amounts of time and resources tracking these. Working with organizations like we tend to forget that colleges were the main market for tobacco in the 1950s. Tobacco ads ran heavily in college newspapers, but they were also under increasing scrutiny in the 1950s for these kinds of practices. And so the industry took very, very careful, followed very carefully sales preferences for Salem, for Winston and Salem, intimately, quarter by quarter, university by university in the early 1960s. And so one of the things that's really surprising about this documentation is behind the image you see here of the young people smoking filtered cools, there's a great level of local specificity and attention to both brand and region in these documents. So one of the recurring surprises of delving deeply, doing a search on menthol, is the extraordinary detail and specific local knowledge that the industry amasses about attitudes, city by city, sometimes neighborhood by neighborhood, campus by campus, economic conditions, health anxieties. When health anxieties begin to rise, linking smoking to cancer in the 1950s and 1960s, the industry becomes aware of the fact that filtered cigarettes are seen by smokers as safer, and so are menthols. And as a result, menthol sales and filtered cigarette sales rise. And the industry begins to study health psychology as a way of understanding how you pivot towards menthol and build menthol brands as health brands for these to meet these new health anxieties of the 50s and 1960s. So the industry is constantly studying health anxieties and health concerns. They're doing health psychology, they're studying smoker psychology, and they're also building relationships that help to support smoking behavior and brand choice. The intensity of their strategic focus in building markets is one of the things I found most surprising, whether that was in thinking about college promotion kits, that is college-themed mascot-specific, school-specific money giveaways, depending on the campus, or whether it's studies like this in Chicago, which tracks feelings of racism, particularly anti-Black racism, around Chicago in the late 1970s among white people that are more aggravated than in the country generally, in which they conclude that anti-Black feelings are also expressed in people's dislike for integrated ads, so that the logic behind which ads are marketed where has very much to do with these kinds of studies that were done to try to anticipate and understand anxieties, attitudes, economic concerns, and psychology. One of the major research challenges of this project, besides just like navigating through millions and millions of documents to find those that are relevant to you, is to identify the key actors and organizations, the companies, the brands, the executives, the studies, and the consultants that are really crucial to one particular moment in time and how those companies, brands, executives, studies, and consultants change. It's a kind of a constantly changing web of relationships. Understanding the business tensions, the strategies and motivations that evolve from the 30s into the 40s, into the 50s and beyond is another major challenge. And then really managing the complexity of the archive. In some ways, creating an archive of the archive becomes an important one. But it's by tracking these individuals that you're able to see, for me, the central important role of people like Howard Haggard as a the Haggard correspondence, which figures prominently in my first chapter in Menthol's early years, or the work of the founder of a company called the Institute for Motivational Research, Ernest Dichter, who discovers and argues that menthol is emergingly popular because it's seen as an evasion by many smokers of the cancer question, as a key figure in my second chapter. And so I just put these images up to illustrate just how collecting documents, PDFs, having a sense of what's in those documents, and going back to them when it came time to write is a crucial kind of management strategy for turning an archive ultimately into a chapter and a chapter into a book. The Truth Tobacco Industry Documents also cover contextual developments, because the industry is not just about tracking its internal dynamics, but also following exogenous, external developments, whether they're hearings or legislative developments or news clippings that have some bearing on sales or the industry itself. And so particularly after the 1964 Surgeon General report that links tobacco with cancer, the industry becomes, they've always been attentive to the public media, but they become even more attentive to these kinds of developments. And so the archive itself is how the industry archives these developments, whether it's the controversy around the Surgeon General's report in '64 or new controversies that emerge in the 1980s over R.J. Reynolds's new effort to market a new Black-themed menthol brand called Uptown, and the scathing criticism that they meet from Louis Sullivan, the then Secretary for Health and Human Services, calling Uptown's message more suffering, more death for a group already bearing more than its share of smoking-related illness and mortality. This tension with Louis Sullivan and the support that the industry seeks from the executive director, surprisingly, of the NAACP, Benjamin Hooks, in defense of the Uptown campaign, provides the centerpiece of a later chapter of the book. So the industry documents show a lot. They show internal dynamics, and they show how firms sought to manage the fallout of these kinds of controversies. The Uptown controversy, it shows how the firm sought to rebuild markets that were lost when the Congress banned nationwide television and radio advertising of cigarettes. It showed how the industry sought to recover from the controversy created by the Uptown branding. And it showed how they tracked and studied the effects of emerging local public health activism, like the work of the work of people like Henry McNeil Brown, who went by the name Mandrake. He was a vigilante who would, at the dead of night, do blackwashing and whitewashing of alcohol and tobacco billboards across Chicago. And his vandalism was actually echoed in other communities in New York and Philadelphia and Dallas. And the industry followed these trends very carefully. So in some ways, the archive becomes a way of understanding how tobacco politics is changing. So the Truth Tobacco Industry Documents cover a wide range of strategies. And for me, it became a study of what I call the push, which is why the book is called Pushing Cool. And also the forces behind the push, the social scientists, the pollsters, the psychologists, the urban studies scholars, even the gender theorists. And the push was not always successful. Let me just make this clear. One of the companies that really never built a successful menthol brand was Philip Morris. And here's a study from 1971 in which they're asking the question, why is it that the cowboy image that has proven so successful in transforming menthol, Marlboro, from a feminine brand into a robust, manly, masculine brand in the 1950s, why is it that it never gained traction in urban Black America? And here's a study from 71, which says you have to understand Black masculinity in relationship to white masculinity. So in some ways, the industry is generating and developing, race and sexuality studies, masculinity studies, and studies of femininity long before these were, or not long before, but around the same time that these are developing as fields of study in the academy itself. So there's surprising developments in terms of the way in which particular ideas about masculinity, gender, race are being deployed, being studied, and then being deployed in advertising. The menthol cigarette story became then the story of, for me, the slow way in which markets are made and remade. The menthol search is a simple search term, but it produces so much information that the challenge becomes, how do you create a storyline? How do you learn what the backstory is of this intense brand competition that evolves over the course of decades? It also became a story that is about explaining the rise of targeted racial urban marketing, particularly in the 1960s. And the argument in the book becomes that it's really the intensification of scrutiny of the college youth-focused advertising in the 50s that prompts the industry to pivot to urban marketing more intensely in the 1960s. And it's in this context that this kind of pitch, a health pitch, becomes this kind of pitch. And this is the fulcrum chapter that you see building in my chapter 3, Building a Black Franchise. It also becomes a study of shining a light on the central role of the players behind these events, the central role of consultants in psychology, physiology, sociology, and marketing in shaping markets and creating preferences and identities. And we often think about consumer preferences as something that are driven internally by the pull, right? That I personally like a certain kind of brand. What the industry documents allow us to understand is the elaborate nature of the push, how demand is created, right? How the push drives these markets and creates markets. I want to just sort of conclude by saying a few things about the implications for the opioid industry documents. When I look at the opioid industry documents, I ask a similar kind of question. How can a particular search term open into a broader story? One of the phrases that became part of the Purdue Pharma campaign very early on in the history of OxyContin was partners against pain. It highlights a central business strategy of building partnerships in order to build OxyContin markets. And so one of the things I did just a couple days ago is I decided to just search the term partners against pain. And one of the first documents you come across is just one slide presentation from very early on in the history of OxyContin, November 2001, at a meeting in which you begin to see already what we now know today, right? Which is how partnerships build markets. I'm not going to get down to the level of specificity, but these documents give a great deal of understanding of the who, particular people, who the regional directors are, what kinds of specific relationships are being formed, et cetera. But I want to just highlight the same kinds of processes that you find here in these archives. as I said, these are just from one sales presentation in November of 2001. And one of the slides talks about the importance of building a sales force, in this case, a sales force of 886 people responsible for generating demand for our products at the clinician level. So from the industry's perspective, this is about how you generate demand. And another slide highlights that the sales department has grown dramatically from 1997, 388,000 to almost a million, 388,000 total primary care physician calls made to almost a million by 2001. And then also highlights that, but this is a year that's really crucial. And this is a strategy of doing historical research for me, which is to focus in on a year by year, sometimes month by month analysis of the archives to try to understand, what the possibilities were at this particular moment, who the actors are, what are the networks, and what are the relationships being formed. And as this document highlights, 2001 was an interesting but also challenging year for sales and field operation. Why? Well, because OxyContin abuse was already quite evident at this time, as was drug diversion, and there were lawsuits already evident. And one of the key challenges of the industry is how do you navigate these controversies? One of the ways the industry did find a way to navigate them is to figure out a way beyond these so-called distractions. As the sales presentation pointed out, despite the many challenges, we had a very good year. And the sales projected for 2001 would be 1.4 billion. And these are their images. These are not mine, right? So you can actually look at the images to try to understand the story that they are telling internally. The document also describes the strategies for the future, which would involve a multi-pronged coordinated approach. On the one hand, battling against Medicaid programs in which there might be skeptics about robust prescribing of OxyContin, building liaisons through educational programs by working with medical boards, pharmacy boards, and what are called thought leaders, seeking new OxyContin opportunities for 2002 with thought leaders in particular fields like anesthesia, or strengthening the cornerstone of our pain franchise. And here's that term again, the pain franchise with oncologists. So this is just one very kind of high-level discussion of one document that emerges out of the search Partners Against Pain, which, like menthol, can begin the process of illuminating the backstory of how markets are made. So I will end there. I will stop sharing my screen, and I'm certainly happy to take any questions that anyone would like to pose.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Wailoo, for that incredible, enlightening presentation. I want to quickly introduce, before we jump into Q&A, and while I'm, prepping everyone, please start populating any questions you may have into the Q&A now. I certainly have plenty, and I don't want to colonize the conversation, but I just wanted to, again, thank you very much for an enlightening talk. My name is Jason Chernesky. I am the OIDA Industry Document Archive. The Opioid Industry Document Archive is OIDA Clear Research Fellow postdoc here that's working on community engagement and outreach for the program. I'm also a historian of medicine, public health, and environmental history here at the Johns Hopkins University Institute, the History of Medicine. I will be monitoring Q&A. I will also be in the workshop portion later. So I just wanted to introduce myself now, and I could talk a little bit more about me later. But I want to stay focused here on what Dr. Wailoo has presented, because as that last bit in the presentation did so well, Dr. Wailoo, is you really showed how that, taking one term or phrase or something can not only, bring you to a document that can illuminate a number of stories, but in there, you were also in the slide, that last slide, you start to see the language or the vocabulary that industry uses to talk to one another, but also that's very important for navigating what is an otherwise tangle of a lot of very complicated, technical, insular or arcane vocabulary. So I wonder if we could start, as many of the questions begin to populate. I'd like to just maybe start with one of my own. And it's for everyone who wants to start using this collection or the OIDA collection in particular, maybe what if you could sort of talk a little bit about how you started to build an archive of the vocabulary. So how you're starting to build out, what are the types of words they're using for certain things that you will then start to pump into the database to pull up more documents. So just kind of curious about your process there and how you started to do that.
Yeah, well, with regard, you're quite right to say that understanding the language is crucial. So two comments about this. One is that we tend to look for the terms that we think are important right now, when in fact, the terminology, so for instance, the language of thought leaders, the idea that the industry understood that one needs to build not so much like-minded people, but people who are shaping broader thinking and thought about pain and about balanced and thoughtful approaches to pain is the way in which you bring you create consensus and you build partnerships. So it's understanding that there's a language of partnerships that is being developed that creates these kinds of coalitions. In the history of the Tobacco Archive, there is this long-standing notion that once the industry pivoted towards working with and marketing intensively to Black populations, they built close relationship with Black civic leaders, with the NAACP and others. And it was always this theme of kind of Black pride and Black power and Black self-determination that were part of. So there's a kind of empowerment theme that the industry learns. There's a language of empowerment that the industry learned. And it's hard to resist in some ways, because after all, who could be opposed to Black pride and Black power and Black self-determination? But it's these kinds of strategies that, alongside monetary support for civic organizations, could help the industry to withstand criticism. And so I think the lesson that I learned from the menthol story that applies here is that what the industry in building thought leaders is actually creating a system not only for building markets, but also for safeguarding itself against criticism, right? That somehow it's doing something that is contrary to the interest of patients. In fact, this is about, patients and self-determination and pain. So that's a good example of how the language of marketing also is the language of sort of storytelling, right? Of telling people stories that give them a sense of their being on the right side of this fight.
That's great. That's really wonderful. And also there's some really interesting corollaries here between what you're saying, how the sort of, the logics of race are sort of infused into the way that menthol cigarettes are marketed, but also going out to Black leaders, right, or developing a language that, or harnessing a language at the time that then gets sort of used to, do this push that you're so, wonderfully telling in the story, in the book. and the story writ large, but you also see this in the opioid industry documents too, where, for example, I've come across stuff where health disparities then starts to become, right, like, so this language of inequity that is either coded in or implicit in something like health disparities or, unequal access to pain medications, for example, you start to see an adoption of this. And it would be interesting for folks to sort of maybe delineate when and how that actually happens. But absolutely, these logics cut across industry, which is really one of the powerful things that your story tells us, but also the industry document library as a whole can do, including, of course, the opioid industry documents. I have a question here from Julia Kaminsky. Comiskey, sorry, I put an N in there for some reason. Maybe because I'm a baseball fan. So here's her question, and Dr. Wailoo, you can answer it if you see fit. So how important do you think it is for users of these archives, so the industry archives, to understand the circumstances that led to their creation? So maybe you could talk about, your experience, and we can, go from there.
Yeah, I would say it's very important, partly because, even though this is unparalleledly, it's an incredibly rich archive, we should understand that any archive that's produced as a result of a legal settlement will only produce the materials that are relevant to that legal settlement, right? So these are only the archival materials that relate to, in the case of the tobacco archives, marketing, advertising, right, and sales. And there's, of course, a lot of other issues in the industry that aren't really part of this legal process. So we ought to be understand, but Julia Kaminsky is right that those circumstances in which the archive is created give us a sense of the kinds of, they constrain the sorts of stories that can be told, but they also unleash just an amazing number of possibilities. But there are going to be gaps. There are multiple gaps in the story. This is why, I consider these archives to be kind of like a research assistant, right? Whenever I do digital work, yes, it's like I'm sending a research assistant out to find me all of this really amazing stuff. But I had to do more work to figure out who Howard Haggard was or who Ernest Dichter was. And I had to actually go to, or have another student go to the Ernest Dichter archives at Hagley, and I had to do more research on Ernest Dichter in order to fully contextualize and understand what he was all about in terms of the work he did for industry. And some of the rich material I found on Ernest Dichter came out of his archive rather than the tobacco industry documents. So in some ways, I would say that it's important to understand that the archives lead you to places, but it's up to you to continue the research to try to find out where else, how else to enrich your understanding of the story.
That's great, and thanks, Julie, for that wonderful question. We got about 4 or 5 minutes, and Louisa Holmes has one here, Dr. Wailoo, about data organization and tracking, and that you talked about it in the presentation, but I think that, as you were saying, this might speak to your building the archive of the archive, right? It can get a little bit unwieldy when dealing with such massive born digital collections. And so Louisa's asking, if you could talk a little bit more, how do you, strategies for keeping track of all the documents that you're uncovering and notate, for future reference, like what you may have found as an effective or efficient way of doing that. And obviously with the caveat that this was how you did it, and we all have our own sort of, organizational schemes, but maybe you could just sort of speak to that, building of the archive piece that you were mentioning before.
Yeah, so this is a really great question and a very important one, Louisa. And what I would say is, every researcher, I think, has their own strategy, and mine involves collecting PDFs, and the PDF is a wonderful organizational tool, but it's also incredibly cumbersome because you read it through, and nowadays it's increasingly easy to annotate PDFs. The way I would do this, though, is that because I'm a historian, I have a year by year way of organizing my thinking, right? What was going on in Purdue Pharma in November 2001 to me is a concrete, specific question. And so I would tend to have PDFs that begin with the title November 2001 or 2001 November. And then often as I read through them, I have a system for separately writing out what I think is important about that document, but also the title I give to the PDF. If you remember from the slide that I showed, let me go back to it. It reminds me, I'm going to share my screen for a second. The title is intended to illustrate the particular time and also the specific reason why I think this document is central to the story of the menthol cigarette. So this Howard Haggard document, 1934, on people who work at Spud. So Spud was one of the first menthol brands. And there was a theory, it's almost kind of laughable now. There was a theory that people who work in Spud factories were exposed to so much menthol that they didn't get colds as much as people who, as other people did, that menthol was somehow a protective against getting a cold. And Howard Haggard was asked to weigh in on this question. And so this was the kind of topic that was at the forefront of, when I document that, it's the Howard Haggard on Spud and cold, so that I can go back even years later and say, yeah, that's that document. And so I need to retrieve it to bring it into my story somehow. So it involves, as you're gathering, early on, you don't know what the story is. So you tend to read and you have hunches as to where the story is going to lead. After you've amassed a fair bit of an archive, you start to see patterns. And when you start to see patterns, that's when your documentation strategy for me becomes more specific, because then you begin documenting in relationship to the patterns that you see, because the patterns become the story. If Howard Haggard had only showed up once in these archives, then I would have seen him once and it would have been totally unnoteworthy. But because he showed up several times as a consultant, commenting, I could see that his role was going to be substantial for me as a scholar, as a historian, and as somebody trying to analyze this as a moment in time. So I can't give a more concrete answer than that, other than it's an unfolding story, because what you are discovering as you do the research is itself unfolding. And so, it'd be great if now that I know what the story is, I could go back and I could say, oh yeah, this document belongs here, this document belongs there. It took me at least a couple of years to figure out what even the story was in its broadest outlines before I could start to say, I'm going to focus on these particular characters.
That's great. And I think that's a great segue too, as we move into the overview of the collection, talking about, these patterns and this is something we'll go over in the workshop a little bit when we do our breakout sessions with everyone, is trying to devise ways as we're navigating what can sometimes be an unwieldy data set to start putting those things together for however you're doing this research or for whatever purposes you're doing the research for. As Professor Wailoo was saying, for historians, those of us, we have a particular way of organizing and collecting our data. Maybe for someone like Adam Kuhn, who's going to be talking about health policy research, or GB, who's going to be talking about, business scholarship, right? All of those things are going to matter differently, but following those patterns is really essential in sort of navigating this sort of web of, interlocking documents that on the surface don't seem to be connected, but obviously, right, we're putting them together, we're the glue. Again, I wanted to thank you so much, Dr. Wailoo, for this presentation and giving us some really great things to talk about in our workshop and ways of thinking about how to navigate this site and asking those kinds of questions based on, and I love this, starting with a search term and then how it kind of then sort of blossoms into a larger narrative, however big that narrative may be. And that's something we'll be going over in our workshop when we talk about snowball search strategies. So this is a perfect setup for that. And I wanted to thank you again for taking the time.
Thank you, Jason. Glad to be here.